Hey, what's up you guys? The Curious Owl here, and today I will be doing my review for The Talisman by Stephen King and Peter Straub. This is the first book in a duology written by both Stephen King and Peter Straub. This is still part of my Stephen King reading series. This just happens to be the very first novel that he had co-authored with another person. So I'm going to try to do these reviews and other reviews in the future a little bit differently. I feel like a lot of times I have been going off the top of my head as opposed to having a little bit more of a structure. So first we're going to go over the synopsis of this, and then we're going to talk about my rating and then the likes and dislikes I have with this. And I'm gonna say now, I have a lot more dislikes than likes, but we'll get into that. So this story basically follows 12-year-old Jack Sawyer, whose mother is dying, and it seems that there is really no way to help her or save her. But when he meets a man named Speedy Parker, he learns about this new way to look at the world, literally, because it basically involves him going into another world called the Territories. And when he learns about the Territories, he learns that there are people that are called twinners, who are essentially the same person in our world, but they are in the other world. Think of them as like your parallel universe self. They might be slightly different in some ways, but otherwise they are the same person. Finds out that the twinner of his mother is the queen of the Territories and is also dying, and he finds out that there is a way for him to not only save his mother in his world, but also to possibly save the queen of the Territories, who is his mother's twinner. And the way that he's able to do this is that he has to find this thing that is called the Talisman. And supposedly this talisman has such power that it will, like I said, not only cure his mother, but then in so facto cure the queen and save the territory. However, while he's learning about the Territories and going on this journey, Jack is faced with various different forms of danger, namely through people that are after him, such as his father's former partner and best friend, who is looking to possibly capture Jack or maybe even kill him. And then on top of that, the people in the Territories are looking to kill Jack because they understand that he is likely to bring about the saving of this world, whereas these people that are after him are looking to somehow dismantle or destroy the Territories as well as Jack's world. So I rated this 3 out of 5 stars. I think that in a lot of ways it was really interesting in terms of the concept of the plot, the idea of, having a hero's journey of sorts with having Jack, be the forefront of this story where he's very young, but he very quickly grows up and you see him go through this entire hero's journey from beginning to end. I love that kind of trope. It is something I've always really loved when it comes to fantasy. So even though this is not 100% a fantasy novel, I really like how the hero's journey trope was kind of brought into this story. It is a very similar writing style to what I know of King. That is another thing that I really enjoyed about it because it did feel very familiar. I don't know whether or not there are things about Peter Straub's writing that would have come through because I have never read a book by Peter Straub. I do not know how his writing style is, if it's similar to King or what, so I don't really know whether or not Peter really had as big of a hand in this as King did, because it truthfully just felt like a King novel as opposed to it being a co-authored story. Now, Jack as a character I really did like also, because although he's very young, he's not overly naive. He has grown up very quickly before the events of this book because he had lost his father in an accident and has been witnessing his mother's slow decline, and it has been very hard for him to essentially cope with a lot of it, but he's basically had to grow up on his own. So at 12 years old, he feels much older than he is. And I think that that really helps with understanding his mindset throughout a lot of this, because how else do you expect a 12-year-old boy who's already seen so much to act at this point and deal with the things that he deals with? Because honestly, I don't know very many 12-year-old boys who have a fairly normal upbringing that would be able to handle any of the stuff that Jack does. So I think of him as a very strong character, but that's coming from, like I said, an already established kind of grown-up perspective. There were a lot of really interesting side characters that came up, but I think my favorite character was Wolf, who we don't see until much later in the story, but I found him to be very comforting, very naive at times, and it definitely had a trope involved where he is brought over to our world, and he is very much a fish out of water. I think sometimes he was a little cartoonish, a little out there, but I still really enjoyed him nonetheless. And I do think that it was an interesting choice to wait until the point that he is brought in to include him, because I would have been interested to see if we had met him maybe way earlier in the story, how that would have affected things. But I think that overall, I really just enjoyed him as the side character, and he was probably the only side character I actually really liked. Like I said, the overall concept of the plot was very interesting. I did like that aspect of it, and the idea of having one particular object that is supposed to save all of humanity, the world, whatever you want to call it. I like that idea too. That's always been something I've really been interested in, and how one particular object has so much importance in a world. So I really did like a lot of the ideas and concepts within this. However, going on the flip side of things, there's a lot of things I did not like. Namely, the most important thing, how slow this book was. This is a nearly 700-page book, and I feel like it took me an eternity to get through. I was very bored throughout a lot of it. I felt like I just was waiting for something to happen, and when things did happen, it wasn't really that impressive. It just was really slow building, and it almost ruined the story for me with how slow it felt. One thing too I would like to talk about, because this is the biggest issue I think I have with this book, is there is a lot of instances of the N-word, the hard N-word, and I honestly cannot remember anymore if I truly was just ignoring the fact that it was used in other King work, because I do know that King has used the N-word a few other times within the past work, but I had always justified it as it is that particular character, not everybody in the story. But it is very, very apparent that it is overused in this book. I felt very uncomfortable many times in this book with the usage of the N-word, and while it was reserved for only certain groups of characters, it felt like basically all of the side characters, all of the other people we met in this story besides Jack and Speedy Parker were using the N-word, and it was not okay with me. I did not like how that was. I feel like I said, it is more apparent in this book how bad it is that, you know, King was using this kind of a word, but I also don't know if it is at all possible that Peter Straub's influence on this had any effect on how much it was used. Was it something that was a choice on his part if he was writing parts of it? Was it completely King? Was it the both of them? I don't know, because like I said, I do know that King had used the N-word in works in the past, but it was very, very minimal in terms of it was reserved for very specific characters in his stories, because it was highlighting specifically who were kind of the more evil, backwards kind of thinking people, whereas it felt like everybody except for two people, like I said, were using the N-word in this. So I don't know what to think about it. Was it a product of its time in some ways? It's possible. This was written back in the early 90s, and so it was still very likely a time where the N-word was being used very, very openly, more so than now. So I don't know whether or not it's truly one thing or another. I just feel like I really see a lot of the issues with the usage of the N-word just purely from this book, because I didn't realize the magnitude that it was used until I read this. So moving aside from that, because there's something else I'd like to get into in terms of King's possible issues in his writing down the line, but one of the other things I want to talk about is the world building about the territories. There's basically none. The most that you understand is that it looks a lot like our world, except it's like a little bit gloomier, I guess, in some ways. But that's about it. There's not really much else in terms of the world building, because it's supposed to be basically a reflection of our world in a sense. But I wish that there would have been more, I guess, defining characteristics that would have made it very apparent this was the territories. I will say in some ways that the territories did remind me of how like the Dark Tower felt in terms of the world building that was involved with that. Like it felt like this was just a part of the Dark Tower area, but I don't even know for certain if this is a part of the Dark Tower series at all or the world, but it had very, very similar vibes in some ways to that. Another thing is that I feel like all of the antagonists were the exact same. They were all super cartoony and very laughable, but laughable in the sense that they were uncomfortable to read about. Like, it was absolutely cringy, the amount of cartooniness that was involved with these antagonists, the main ones, the side ones, the henchmen. Every single person that was supposed to be a bad person in this book felt like a complete joke. I don't think I have seen a Stephen King book up to this point where the antagonists were as weird and wacky as these guys. And there were quite a few weird ones from the Dark Tower series, do not get me wrong, but at least they were few and far in between, whereas it felt like, again, every single bad guy in this book was a cartoon, and it was just not okay. I did not like that at all. One of the biggest plot aspects about this that I don't feel like I understood very well is the idea of Morgan Sloat. Now, Morgan Sloat is, like I said, he is the person that is chasing Jack in both the territories and in Jack's world. He is basically his father's former partner and supposed best friend, but you learn very quickly that Morgan has a lot more to do with some of the bad things that have happened in Jack's life prior to the beginning of this story. And he is chasing Jack all throughout this as Jack is going after the Talisman. But the problem is that we don't really understand a whole lot of the reasoning as to why. We don't understand a lot of the mystery surrounding around Jack's father's death. We don't know if there was, something to do with the Talisman itself and the territories, like what exactly happened with that. There were also plenty of opportunities for Morgan Sloat to go off and kill Jack's mother, which then basically would have killed the queen and the territories. So why did it not happen? And at any point, was he waiting for the cancer to kill her? Like, I don't understand a lot of the choices that this character had, and I feel like I said, a lot of the motivations and a lot of the things and reasonings of this story with his character were not very clear, and I don't know why or what exactly was supposed to happen with this. All right, so going back to some of the issues that I'm starting to recognize about Stephen King. In addition to the overusage of the N-word, there is this overwhelming stereotypical characterization of Black people, namely with the only Black character we really see in this, Speedy Parker. If you have read anything prior to this book in King's work, you would probably remember characters such as Mother Abigail from The Stand, Odetta from the Dark Tower series, Dick Hallorann from The Shining. Those characters stick out in my mind as very, very stereotypical Black people. Very overcharacterized, the men specifically being very kooky and crazy, and the women having very kind of almost mammy-like ideas involved with them. I really recognized that aspect being placed with Speedy. Speedy was a very interesting character in the sense that he is somebody that teaches Jack about the territories, but he seems to have no actual connection to Jack and his family. But he is able to go into the territories and he knows about what Jack is supposed to do. He's kind of an oracle of sorts, but his personality in general is very kooky, very crazy, very synonymous with a Black male stereotype where they're kind of looked at as the fool. And I did not like that. I feel like there was a very specific choice within that I think should have been really looked at further, but I don't know. Again, this made me start thinking about several other characters that I have seen over the course of King's work up to this point. And thinking about Mother Abigail and Odetta and Dick Hallorann, it was very apparent to me that at the time I read those books and saw those characters, I really missed a lot of the stereotypicalness that was being used with those characters. Odetta was probably the least in terms of that, mostly because Odetta also was basically two personalities that later on in the Dark Tower series was fused into one, but one particular personality of hers was the angry Black woman stereotype through and through, and I knew that in some capacity, but didn't recognize how stereotypical that was until getting through this and recognizing the fact that that has been a very common theme with King's work up to this point when it comes to Black characters. So I actually feel like I understand a lot more why people I know who are Black or other people of color seem to dislike a lot of Stephen King's, especially his older work, because he's kind of a jerk when he writes Black characters. They are not very well received, and I get it. I understand now. I apologize to any of my Black friends who have been trying to maybe talk to this about me, but didn't feel like that I was understanding. I think I kind of get the idea a little bit more, and I greatly apologize for that ignorance, because apparently I needed to read this book to figure out that issue. Moving on from that, there are a couple other things that I have issues with, namely one of the side characters, Richard. He was just this whiny little boy. I don't like him at all. He had no purpose in the story. I don't feel like he was even used as a bargaining chip, because Richard is Morgan's son, and he ends up joining in with Jack much further in the story to essentially take down his father and everything. But he's not even like looked at as a possible bargaining chip. He's not, you know, he had literally no purpose. He did absolutely nothing to help the story. All he did was sit there and whine and complain. There was actually no real reason to even have him as a character at all. Like, it would have been perfectly fine if Morgan did not have a child at all to deal with. And I feel like also the fact that he was involved so late in the book was kind of not needed, because again, he didn't really do anything, and if he was to be included, it should have been a lot sooner, similar to how I felt with Wolf. And I just don't understand why he was even in the book in the first place. In addition to Jack's main perspective, we do get slight chapters here and there from Morgan Sloat's point of view. I found them to be completely unnecessary. This book would have been perfectly fine if they were not even involved, because they didn't really add anything to the story. Maybe to kind of see how things were happening on his end, what exactly Morgan was doing and how he was planning things and what exactly he was thinking. But you really didn't need him. You truthfully did not need any of his perspective in this. I felt like it was kind of just pointless to have it in the first place. So why does this still have a 3 out of 5 stars if I have so many negatives about it? I do think that overall the concept was really interesting, and I just wish that this was executed a lot better. This is basically one of those scenarios where the idea is great, the theory's there, but the actual execution of the entire experiment of the story falls very, very flat. I think that there are some things that definitely make this story a lot better. Like I said, with Jack as a main character, Wolf is one of the side characters, and the overall concept of the trope of the hero's journey and the trope of the one object saving everything. I really like those things, and I think that that definitely saved some aspects of this, but overall, very much something I will not ever reread. I do not think that this is something I would very much enjoy. I think that it definitely is something I will say is a good example of understanding why people of color do not like Stephen King. Now, is that to say that anything newer of his could be the exact same? I don't know. I've only read a handful of things that were much newer, but from what I understand, some of the newer work doesn't rely on that Black stereotypical characterization, but I have to kind of get to those books that are newer before I can make a final decision of whether or not I think he's changed as an author. So the second book is called Black House, and I want to talk about some of my thoughts and ideas and hopes for the second book, because I do know what the idea of it is, and I will share that synopsis with those of you that are interested in it. But basically, my hopes for the second book, Black House, I would like to have a lot less reliance on the stereotyping of Black characters. I think it is absolutely unnecessary. And also because this book is published many years after The Talisman, I would expect there to be that change because it's written and published in a different time. So I would hope that there are some thoughts in terms of that stereotyping that is kind of removed from the story. Second of all, I hope that the pacing is much quicker, despite the fact that the book itself is about as long as The Talisman, around 700 pages. And thirdly, if Richard is a character that does become involved in this second book, I really hope that there's a lot less whining, because especially since that this story is supposed to take place when Jack is an adult and Richard's an adult, hopefully Richard has grown up and has stopped all his whining, because for God's sake, that was so annoying. So I'm going to read really quickly the synopsis of it and basically look at what some thoughts and ideas about it are. So 20 years ago, a boy named Jack Sawyer traveled to a parallel universe called the Territories to save his mother and her Territories twinner from a premature and agonizing death that would have brought cataclysm to the other world. Now Jack is a retired Los Angeles homicide detective living in the nearly non-existent hamlet of Tamarack, Wisconsin. He has no recollection of his adventures in the Territories and was compelled to leave the police force when an odd happenstance event threatened to awaken those memories. When a series of gruesome murders occur in western Wisconsin that are reminiscent of those committed several decades earlier by a real-life madman named Albert Fish, the killer is dubbed the Fisherman, and Jack's buddy, the local chief of police, begs Jack to help his inexperienced force find him. But is this merely the work of a disturbed individual, or has a mysterious and malignant force been unleashed in this quiet town? What causes Jack's inexplicable waking dreams, if that is what they are, of robin's eggs and red feathers? It's almost as if someone is trying to tell him something. As that message becomes increasingly impossible to ignore, Jack is drawn back to the Territories and to his own hidden past, where he may find the soul strength to enter a terrifying house at the end of a deserted tract of forest, there to encounter the obscene and ferocious evils sheltered within it. So like I said, this is supposed to basically be reminiscent, I think, of the idea where, similar to The Shining and Dr. Sleep, the books were written years apart, basically. They're published years after the original, possibly due to popular demand in this case, because I know that with Dr. Sleep, it was by popular demand. For about 30 years, Stephen King had been racking his brain to answer the question of what happens to Danny. I wonder if this is kind of the same idea, because based on the ending of The Talisman, it would make sense why we would have those questions of what exactly happens. Does, Jack remember anything? Like, what exactly happens to them when they're older? What could they possibly do, be getting up to that makes things kind of more back to normal? Is there anything about the world and the magic that's involved with it that, could come into our world again? There's a lot of questions surrounding around that. On top of that, why is it that Jack doesn't remember? Is it similar to kind of how Danny was, where things were very PTSD related, where he kind of pushed a lot of the memories of what happened below the surface? Is it something where the magic involved with the Territories, or, the traveling between and the lack of going back and forth between the Territories ultimately wipes his mind? I'm very curious to see what happens. Did the Talisman actually end up doing that? Was that object the cause of the wiping of the mind? Does it come back into play at all? And I'm curious to see if Black House ends up being better than the Talisman, like Dr. Sleep was better than The Shining for me, because Dr. Sleep is one of my favorite Stephen King books, namely because I just loved every second of it, whereas The Shining, I really didn't get into it. I didn't like it as much. I felt that Danny needed more involved in that one that he got in Dr. Sleep. And so I'm very curious to see whether Black House has kind of the same effect, where Black House is much better than the Talisman. And that's my genuine positive hope for that. But let me know what you guys ended up thinking about the Talisman if you read it yourself. I know that I may have a bit of an unpopular opinion, and I may have said a few things that might irritate some people out there, because I mentioned the stereotyping of Black people and the use of the N-word, but there are things that make me uncomfortable as a white person, because I have people I care about that would be reading this material, and it is not okay for an author to use that kind of a language in the grandiose way that it was done in this book. You can hate me all you want for all the negative things I say about King. I really don't give two shits. I'm sick and tired of feeling like I have to watch what I say when it comes to certain fan bases just because I have a different opinion. And I'm also somebody who is not gonna ever be a full fangirl of an author that has legitimate issues with some of their older work. So if you're one of those real diehard fanboys or fangirls, take a seat. Like, actually look back at some of the things that are done with his work and see if it's actually necessary, because willing to bet most of it is not. Thank you all so much for joining me, though. If you guys did enjoy this video, please do give it a big thumbs up. And if you haven't already and you'd like to be and would like to see more content like this, go ahead and hit that button down below and subscribe to become an owlet in our flock. And I will see all of you guys in my next video. Bye, guys.